fill in the room. Good morning, good afternoon again. Thanks for joining us and welcome to the fifth and final event in this global initiative series on the use of target sanctions to counter organized crime. Over the course of the month and a half, we have outlined how the use of sanctions against criminal actors has grown from an approach that is limited to the US, predominantly leveraged to respond to Colombian drug trafficking threats, to a far larger number of jurisdictions employing them, and expansion of the types of criminal actors that are targeted by sanctions regimes. We have detailed the framework for assessing the impact of such sanctions. And we also had deep dive sessions looking at specific case studies, first in the impact of the Kimberley process on the diamond and gold sectors in CAR. We also had the session discussing sanctions on the gang crisis in Haiti, and most recently, a webinar discussing the impact of sanctions in Guinea-Bissau. All of this series is recorded and available free in our website. So please feel free to explore some of the previous sessions and check it out. Today, we are holding a webinar that brings together two different initiatives from the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, the Sanctions Initiative and the Global Organized Crime Index. For those who are not familiar with the Global Index, you can check the tool and the website that we're going to put on the chat. Is totally free of charge. What we will be discussing today is how the Global Organized Crime Index can be used as a tool for both analyzing the impact of sanctions and, crucially, helping to design strategies involving sanctions meant to counter organized crime. But first, I would like to turn to my colleagues that they will introduce themselves, Laura Dahl and Matt Herbert. Laura, first you.
Thanks, Ana Paula, and thanks to all of our attendees joining today. My name is Laura Dahl, and I'm the director of the Global Organized Crime Index at the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. And I'm very happy to be participating in this sanctions webinar series, even as it comes to an end. I look forward to today's discussion.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Echoing Laura, it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you all for attending. My name is Matt Herbert. I'm the head of research for North African Sahel at the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. And I also co-lead our focused research initiative on the use of targeted sanctions against organized crime.
Thanks both for your introductions. And I would like to start this conversation with Laura. For those who may not be familiar with the index, Laura, could you please walk us through the tool and tell its features to the audience? Thanks.
Sure. So the Global Organized Crime Index is the Global Initiative's flagship product and really first tool of its kind that assesses levels of organized crime and countries' resilience to criminality for all 193 UN member states. It was first launched in 2021 and is published every 2 years. So we came out with the second edition just last September, and we're currently working on the third edition set to come out in 2025. Now, under the index's criminality component, the scope, scale, and value of 15 different criminal markets are measured, along with the influence of 5 categories of criminal actors. On the other hand, for resilience, 12 resilience indicators are assessed for each country to determine their capacity to respond to organized crime. Now, the tool is an expert-led assessment, so we have over 400 experts worldwide evaluating and assigning scores for each of those 32 criminality and resilience indicators, with the scores assigned for each country based on a scale of 1 to 10 in a process that involves multiple rounds of independent reviews. And from these assessments, organized crime patterns and trends can be identified, and broader issues like governance, like conflict and development, can then be analyzed and interpreted for each country, as well as regionally and internationally. And so the index really is an attempt to build a systematic approach and a comprehensive knowledge hub on organized crime and how it looks on a country level, a regional one, and worldwide, and importantly, how different states are approaching the organized crime threats that they face.
Yeah, just to jump in here quickly, I think it's important to underscore that the index is really the first time that we've seen any organization attempt to publicly track over time, worldwide, across a number of different criminal markets, the intensity of the challenge and how it's shifting. So this is really quite new. I think it's also important to stress that, on a country level, what the index effectively produces is a quantitative snapshot of the criminal ecosystem. And this ecosystem, as I've said in other webinars, this is really important. This goes beyond individual criminals, criminal networks, beyond markets themselves, to show how the broader set of actors that relate to organized crime, either on a full-time or a more ad hoc basis, engage and fit together, and how crucially these ecosystems evolve, which from a sanctions point of view is absolutely essential. And we often talk of criminal markets and networks as discrete entities, but in reality, they're deeply embedded in some larger structures and aided in their operations by a number of different actors, including, crucially, state-embedded actors, which I know has been a real large focus of the index work, and it's done a great job tracking the nature of different actors within these ecosystems, how they link up, and how different markets kind of influence and respond to each other.
Thanks. I think it's important to explore some of the points that you both mentioned with regards to trends as well as criminal actors. But before that, I just want to remind the audience that this webinar series is in a Q&A format, so you can participate and drop your questions in the Q&A function in the bottom of the Zoom page. So going to that point, given that we had 2 editions of the index that came out so far, perhaps Laura, could you outline some of the trends that we are seeing globally?
Yeah, so the overarching trend that we're seeing is that globally, overall criminality is on the rise, and resilience has stayed pretty much at the same levels it was back in 2021. And so we can say that on a global level, resilience measures in whatever form they may be are falling short in addressing the ever-evolving organized crime landscape.
That's indeed a very worrying trend. And about actors, who is actually engaging in this criminal activity?
Yeah, well, what's interesting is that just like in 2021, the global average for criminal actors in 2023 was higher than the criminal markets average, meaning that criminal actors are driving up overall criminality. And what that may suggest is that criminal groups may be polycriminal, in that to whatever degree they may have a hand in multiple illicit economies, and that itself is more powerful than the pervasiveness of any given individual market. Now, if we look at the specific types of criminal actors, and Matt referred to this, we find that state-embedded actors, so in other words, those actors that are acting from within any level of the state apparatus, were the most prevalent actor type worldwide. While foreign criminal actors, so again, these are criminal actors who are operating outside of their home country, actually grew the most since 2021. I also want to highlight here the role of the private sector as perpetrators of criminality. So private sector actors is a new indicator that we introduced back in 2023. And while it's ranked 4th out of the 5 criminal actor types under the index, they do play an important role for things like laundering money for other criminal groups, acting as informants, and so on. And so within the context of sanctions, which is of course what we're here to discuss today, as opposed to sanctioning whole countries, the use of targeted sanctions on individuals or groups that are engaged in corruption and or illicit activities reflects, I think, a response to mitigate the largest threat, and that is to deal with the actual perpetrators of crime rather than tackling any particular illicit market.
So picking up on this point that you mentioned, I'd like to turn next to how the index can be used within the context of sanctions. But first, perhaps it would be good to get a sense on how the Global Initiative sees strategy on the use of sanctions. So perhaps, Matt, over to you.
Sure. Thanks, Anna. So yeah, I think what the Global Initiative's research has found on strategy is while there's been a massive increase the use of sanctions against transnational organized crime by a number of different jurisdictions, the way they're being thought about and analyzed and really strategized too derives from older country-focused regimes. So, for example, trying to get South Africa to halt their apartheid policies or to prevent North Korea from furthering its proliferation activities. This is problematic for two reasons. First, in older country-focused regimes, you're inherently working against the state. And that influences how you design strategy and how you seek to assess strengths and weaknesses, which oftentimes for states really revolves around the sanctions and broader strategy that you're putting in place. So how is it that you can create a strategy that starts to deal with weaknesses while starting to mitigate some of the strengths that allow for resilience against sanctions or against the strategy you're putting in place? So if we think about organized crime separately, in contrast, basically, in contrast with organized crime, states think of themselves are as facing a real risk of destabilization or endemic violence from organized crime groups. And so there's really more of an opportunity to work with them to start countering the threat. But to design a effective strategy, you really need to have access to information on what criminal ecosystems in a given country look like, where the state involved is weak and strong vis-a-vis organized crime. So rather than working against states, when you're designing strategies to counter organized crime, you're looking to work with states, especially when you're using sanctions. Some of the best impacts that we've seen, for example, in Colombia or even in Libya, have involved sanctions efforts by external states. So in the case of Colombia, the US, in the case of Libya, the United Nations, crucially working in tandem with national authorities. Effectiveness by the US on using sanctions against the Cali cartel in Colombia, for example, hinged on the fact that it was one part of a broader strategy that was developed in tandem with the government of Colombia and put in place and adopted with them. And so that really allowed for something new. But like I was saying, you really need to have a good, close tracking of information in order to design those strategies. And that information doesn't necessarily sit with states. They may be looking at parts of the information picture. But I think what the index allows, because it's being sourced from a number of different informational sources, it's drawing in civil society, it's looking cross-border, is that it allows more of a consolidated approach to putting information together. I think the second thing that's important to keep in mind when you're looking at the difference between sanctions focused on states and sanctions focused on organized crime is that in the sort of country regimes that I referred to before, you're generally generally aiming to change a specific policy or scenario on the part of the states. So oftentimes it's relatively clear-cut. So ceasing aggression, halting the development of weapons of mass destruction. Basically, you're driving towards that goal. By contrast, when you get to criminal and corruption thematic regimes, these are typically very open-ended and less clear on the distinct and realistically attainable goals that they're seeking. Is it changing the behavior of a single criminal? Is it sending a single signal? We don't think so. That's one way to interpret it. But generally speaking, in our engagements with sanctions professionals globally and the way that we look at criminal ecosystems and how they respond, is that there's room for more. There's room to think bigger on this. With multiple designations under a single sanctions regime, or even multiple different sanctions regimes that focus on crime and corruption, focused on a single criminal ecosystem in a given region or a given country, having the potential really to systemically disrupt that ecosystem or to strategically shape it to mitigate key harms. But crucially, I think that if you're going to either disrupt or systemically shape, This requires both the development of forward-thinking strategies, so combining a number of different policy tools, ideally drawing on a number of different countries to implement those tools. So not just the sanctioning jurisdiction and other ministries within that jurisdiction, but drawing together essentially a coalition. You as well need a clear-eyed assessment of the nature of the challenge, what the broader criminal ecosystem looks like, what state resilience looks like, and the trajectory of travel in terms of how both are changing. And once you do this, you can start to build strategies that draw in a number of different states, including, crucially, those states that are facing the greatest and most acute harms posed by organized crime, to work in tandem together using sanctions and other tools to begin to counter this, this defined harm or this defined challenge.
Okay, so based on that, Laura, how can the index be used within the context of sanctions?
Yeah, so I agree with Matt, and I want to stress that on sanctions, the index can be really useful in two key ways. So first, it can give a macro level overview to sanctioning authorities and help them identify where the biggest criminal threats are, where different criminal actors are particularly strong, and how the different components of a criminal ecosystem kind of fit together and how they're likely to shift. But I also want to touch upon here a little bit more on resilience. So as I mentioned earlier, the index evaluates countries' ability to respond to organized crime. And part of that resilience includes things like international cooperation. So in other words, looking at the structures and those processes that are in place of interaction, of policy making, and concrete implementation by countries beyond the national level to respond to organized crime. Another facet of resilience under the index looks at countries' law enforcement capacity, so their ability to investigate, protect, and enforce procedures against organized crime. So the index can help sanctioning bodies by informing their priorities based not only on identifying those criminal targets, but also looking at the countries where sanctions would actually be enforced and allowing them to assess those countries' capacities to help enforce those sanctions. So I think so that they can actually figure out the best way to embed those measures within a broader strategic cooperation framework. Now, the second way the index can be useful is through a temporal lens. So because the index is an iterative process, with its biennial publication, stakeholders are able to monitor and see if sanctions imposed have had some sort of effect in the decline in criminal actors or activities. But I want to be very clear here that the index cannot definitively determine whether any rise or decline in criminality anywhere is due in whole or in part to any sanctioning framework. The tool just doesn't evaluate things on that level. However, if sanction regimes are strategically used to complement other measures to combat organized crime, then index users should be able to see how criminality changes over time, and that in turn can help them assess the effectiveness of their response measures.
Thanks, Laura. And Matt, in previous webinars, you've talked a lot about using sanctions to shape criminal ecosystems. Do you see the index contributing to that too?
Yeah, absolutely. So to recap, I should perhaps start. To recap for those who haven't seen the previous webinars or read our previous work on this, we see an important strategic goal of sanctions regimes as being shaping the situation. And what this means effectively is altering the functioning of a criminal ecosystem, generally by influencing the cost-benefit assessments made by both designated, so those people who've been sanctioned, and crucially non-designated actors, so those who haven't been sanctioned, in order to deter or to minimize certain harms or promote adherence to certain norms of behavior. Now, sanctions kind of inherently are very selective. And this selection of targets is often due to specific harms linked to a certain group, such as involvement with specific types of narcotics, acute or very high profile and egregious violence, money laundering activities, which pose a broader threat to financial systems, or in some cases, the sort of high-level corruption that poses defined stability risks to states hosting these groups. Now, often these harms that they offer an advantage to organized crime groups are not necessarily integral to the functioning of the market. So, for example, scam centers in Southeast Asia. Now, if you look at scam centers in Southeast Asia, and this has been in the news a lot lately, and if you look at kind of scams globally, a lot of them are linked back to a relatively small number of scam centers that are sitting either in Myanmar, in Laos, or in Cambodia. One of the very interesting elements of these scam centers, and one of the very harmful elements of them, is the fact that they essentially integrate human trafficking into the business model. So rather than just recruiting a number of individuals to attempt to perpetrate scams, so to convince people to invest money and ultimately lose that money to the scammers, what they do is trick individuals into coming to the scam centers with illicit offers of work. They place them there. They don't allow them to leave. Oftentimes, there are substantial threats of violence posed to these workers if they don't hit certain thresholds. Murders and other trafficking activities are quite prevalent. Now, it's important to note that this element of human trafficking is not integral to scamming. This is something that's developed as advantageous to the groups involved. But if they set aside human trafficking entirely, they'd still be able to make a substantial amount of money. And so this is an area where you actually can concretely see avenues for using sanctions and for using other avenues of state power to begin to address the situation. And I think you're seeing that in real time in Southeast Asia today. So the combination of sanctions by the United Kingdom, prosecutorial approaches as prepared by the People's Republic of China, the use of diplomatic pressure by the US and as well Australia on governments in the region, all these are having an influence and starting to hem in the situation facing the organized crime groups running these scam centers. And so it's likely that with more dedicated strategy, with more activities by different jurisdictions, that you actually realistically could see an end to some of the most egregious and harmful aspects of these scam centers, especially trafficking, even though realistically the scams meted out by them may continue. So this also requires that we define what our level of success is and be a bit nuanced. So effectively, I think, for us, shaping it's a strategically important goal, especially if the harm you're seeking to limit is particularly destabilizing or, like in the case of Southeast Asia, egregious. I'd also say that shaping is not necessarily a one-time strategy. Rather, it's a process where you use different tools to counter the identified harm. And in some cases, recognize that other harms may also emerge. So as you shape a situation, it's not simply going to fade away. Rather, it's going to evolve. There's a resilience within organized crime groups and an adaptability. And, in slowly building up these policy tools and shaping the situation, you're going to slowly shift how the criminal ecosystem evolves. But doing this really requires a lot of information and a lot of close tracking to see how the overall situation in a given country is evolving, how different criminal markets and the overall criminal ecosystem are responding over time. I think it's important here to really flag something that Laura had touched upon earlier, which is that a lot of the groups that we see in the index are polycriminal groups. So they're involved in more than one market. And so what you might see happen is a single organized crime group slowly shifts its activities out of one market and into another as kind of the risks that it faces, the challenge that it faces shift between different markets. And if you're looking to essentially get ahead of that group, you need to recognize that that evolution is going to occur. And something like the index is an important tool for tracking those changes. I'd also flag that because the index is global, it's possible for us not just to track how shaping is occurring in the country in question. So in Myanmar, in Cambodia, in Laos, in Libya, in Colombia, but also looking regionally. And this is really, really important because in many cases, criminal ecosystems sit not just within one country, but they splay across borders and they have impacts in a regional fashion. And this, I think, you see reflected in some of the key difficulties in using only law enforcement and prosecutions to try to counter these groups. As you find high-level leaders very routinely crossing borders, getting out of jurisdictions where they face prosecutorial risks and moving into those where the risk of being apprehended or the risk of a prosecution being allowed to go ahead is less common. I think it's also important to flag finally that when it comes to shaping the index is also a warning tool. What our research has really found is that whether or not sanctioning jurisdictions intend to shape the situation with sanctions as a strategic objective, the issuance of designations often results in reshaping regardless. I think the same could be said of broader strategies that involve multiple tools. This is going to shape the situation whether you intend to or not. So, for example, in the Central African Republic, which one of our reports covers, we did a webinar on previously within this series, we tracked how the Kimberley process, which focuses on diamonds, and it's a very blunt tool for countering essentially the export of conflict like diamonds. What this did when imposed on the Central African Republic or on different areas within that country was shape preferences on the part of armed groups and criminal groups away from diamonds, but towards gold. And so you've seen a reshaping of the economy, but one that arguably is just as destabilizing and just as impactful on human rights as what was left with the Kimberley process. There was no real attempt to get in front of these groups and put up the sort of shaping tools and shaping barriers to really positively impact the situation going forward. And so what we see is that unintended shaping can be vitally problematic. And it can lead to the evolution of a lot of unanticipated harms, which can prove equally destabilizing as the original issue that sanctioning jurisdiction was looking to address. So even if there's no desire by the sanctioning authorities to strategically shape, they can still assess the evolution of a situation in a given country and regionally track whether sanctions and other tools are leading to an unanticipated and potentially problematic de facto shaping of the criminal situation via the index tool. So looking at how things are happening over time and across borders, as Laura flagged.
Thanks, Matt. I do think that this point that you mentioned on warning is a very interesting point, and I would refer the audience as well to the webinar on Guinea-Bissau, where some of those dynamics were also explored. I do have still a question for both of you before I turn to the audience for their questions. I would like to know where we go from here in both initiatives, the sanctions and the index. So perhaps if I start with Laura first.
Yeah, thank you. So for the index, and Matt referred to this earlier, the value of the tool grows over time. So every iteration that is published is another data set that's added into this large repository of global data on organized crime and resilience. And through this standardized and repeated process, we'll be able to better compare geographies to one another, to compare different illicit activities and responses to one another, and see not only how these dynamics have evolved, but eventually, as we move forward, hopefully incorporate a predictive function within the index to give us some insight on what may come. This, in turn, I think can help guide more deep dive research, analysis, and ultimately policy implementation. Now, in the meantime, I also want to highlight that beyond the tool itself, we produce a range of analytical pieces and products that explore the index findings over the years and their effects on policymaking, on anti-organized crime measures, and analysis from thematic or regional perspectives. And we often link those to current events and emerging trends. So we continue to do that, and we'll do it up through the publication of the 2025 index and beyond. So, for example, we produce a monthly blog series, for example, along with a video podcast. I believe our latest episodes were on drug trafficking through the Netherlands, all the way to assassinations in the taxi industry in South Africa. And I believe we have another episode coming out soon on arms trafficking and the war in Ukraine. So go ahead and check that out on our website. We have lots of content, index content coming up, and hopefully would like to explore more. We'll do some more in terms of the context of sanctions.
Yeah, so I mean, on the focused research initiative on sanctions that the global initiative has been engaged in, this is an ongoing thing for us. So we have a number of different research initiatives that are in the field right now. Some of them are looking at regional case studies. So we have work that's ongoing, for example, on the impact of targeted sanctions on corruption within the Balkans. We as well are working on some interesting research that looks at the thematic angle. So how it is, for example, that sanctions have been used against human smuggling and human trafficking, and crucially, how they can be adapted to be more impactful. And so this is ongoing right now. There's a strong focus within this research on the Sahel and North Africa, and as well the scan centers that I referenced earlier. We're also starting to think in more of a strategic vein. So thinking about how it is that sanctions can be effectively paired with other tools, paired with prosecutions, paired with essentially with aid, paired with policing assistance, paired with other sorts of national tools. And the goal here is to really start to lay out comprehensive approaches that can start to influence how it is that the international community thinks of sanctions when it comes to addressing organized crime, how they can be embedded into strategy better. Because I think one of the things that we've seen, not just through our research, but through presentations to UN audiences and others, is that oftentimes sanctions and coercive measures are thought about as essentially standing to the side of the international community's response toolkit to organized crime. They're looked at as this thing that has been used in the past against states. And while, obviously there is this growing momentum to use them against criminality, it's not quite there yet. And I think presenting some concrete ideas for how strategy can be developed, strategy can be implemented and operationalized, and crucially, starting to get the discussion of sanctions away from the idea being that sanctions are kind of a fire and forget tool, where you deploy sanctions and then that's the end of the story. Sanctions are one part of a broader strategy. Crucially, they need to be refined. They need to be done with an eye towards how it is that they shape the situation. And only through that very clear-eyed approach to the tool can you really hope to have the sort of impact and get the other necessary actors on board, be they other states or civil society or others that are going to be crucial to responding to the organized crime challenge. I think the final thing that I'd flag is foresight. And this is something that I brought up a couple times in this webinar, and I brought up a number of times in other webinars. There oftentimes seems to be some strategic surprise when organized crime situations evolve, when they shift. And states are, generally speaking, quite slow in responding to them policy-wise. Policies, put simply, take a lot of time to develop. They need to go through a number of different kind of development stages, development processes before finally being signed off on. And by the time they hit the ground and start to impact the ground, either the ground has already shifted, or the implementation of that policy shifts the ground in ways that that make the future feasibility of that policy problematic. Put simply, it's not quite hitting its mark. So one of the things that we think is that the use of foresight should be an integral part of a lot of strategy development. Foresight to identify how it is that organized crime groups and criminal ecosystems in a given country or given region are likely to respond to a range of policy tools, including sanctions. and foresight that is done on a regular basis. So quarterly, trimestrally, you know, is done in a regular, rapid fashion so as to draw in these sort of insights to the governments that are involved. And we think that for that, the index is really crucial. You can't really do foresight until you know where you are and where you've been. And then you can start to chart a trajectory forward. And so as we develop more of our thinking around foresight and organized crime and sanctions, we think that the engagement with the index is going to be completely vital. And we're really looking forward to this latest iteration in 2025 of what they're doing so we can start to factor that into our analysis and into our foresight activities.
That all sounds very exciting. I do have a couple of questions for both of you. I think the first one is targeting to Laura. How can organized crime be tackled through sanctions if state-embedded actors are found to be the primary vectors of criminality? And then we also have a question that I think is more tailored to Matt, perhaps, looking at strategy for sanctions, how practically this can be instrumentalized. What is the utility of using open sources for a strategy as well? So I'll take a couple of questions now, and then we can do another round if that's okay. So first to Laura and then Matt.
Sure thing. So it's a good question. I think the way to answer the question of state embedded actors requires a bit of nuance in our approach into how we look at them. So I mentioned state embedded actors are the most dominant vector globally, but their influence extends to different echelons of power. That is to say that a high state embedded actor score under the index for a country might not necessarily reflect criminality embedded at the highest levels of the state apparatus. Very often it is lower level officials that facilitate or engage in criminal activities and corruption. And so it's not inevitable that political will to tackle organized crime, including through sanctions, is absent if a country ranks high under state embedded actors under the index. I think in those cases, it's important to focus on building the capacity of state institutions that have shown integrity in the implementation of their functions, including through processes that increase transparency or offer oversight roles. I think that's quite key. In the environments where state embedded actors are extremely pervasive, there are other responses that could be leveraged and have been, and these are based on the active participation of non-state actors like civil society and media to complement higher level strategies to respond to organized crime, including sanctions implemented by government partners.
You want me to launch right into strategy?
Yes, please go ahead, Matt.
Okay. Yeah, so I think this is a really interesting question, and it's important. Like, how do you effectively do strategy? When should strategies be essential? When are they a little bit more ancillary? I think they're absolutely essential in situations in which organized crime poses such a distinct range of harms as to destabilize a state, like really and truly destabilize the functioning of the state, or to destabilize regions. I think drawing again on something we've talked about before in this webinar series, which is Haiti, this is a perfect example here. If you look at Haiti, the challenge comes from organized crime. While there are political aspects to the gangs that are active in Haiti, at the end of the day, they're much closer to traditional organized crime groups than they are to the sort of non-state armed groups, insurgents or terrorists or others that the international community has spent much of the last 20 years responding to. Nonetheless, we've used pretty much the same toolkit with Haiti as what was used previously with terrorists and insurgents. We haven't adapted something new. And I think if you look at the situation in Haiti, the reality is that the criminal groups there operate in ways that are both embedded within the Haitian context, but also highly dependent on regional support and regional engagement. They're dependent on arms coming from a variety of different vectors: the United States, the Dominican Republic, South America, Central America, kind of a variety of different sources. They're also dependent on funds coming in through their involvement in regional drug trafficking. So if you look at some of the key gang leaders, they profit tremendously off drugs that are essentially moving through Haiti on their way to Europe, but originally coming from Colombia oftentimes. And so how do you start to design a regional strategy on that? First, I think, is the recognition. The recognition needs to be had that the organized crime challenge requires a regional response. It requires the actors that are deeply vested in Haiti's future stability and security coming together to look at the tools that they have in front of them. This shouldn't just be the United States and Canada and the European Union. It necessarily needs to involve Caribbean states who have already been deeply involved in responding to the issue on the diplomatic side. It needs to involve South American states. It needs to involve Central American states. It needs to involve a broad set of stakeholders. And each one of those states is going to bring something different to the table. So, for example, if you look at the prosecutorial approaches that the Dominican Republic or Jamaica or Colombia could use to start to counteract the power of Haitian gangs via addressing the proxies that are active in their own jurisdictions, this is one step. If you look at what the U.S. can do on prosecutorial approaches, or Canada can do on issues around, especially the activities of dual nationals and elites who are destabilizing the situation in tandem with gangs, this is another kind of response to the issue. Sanctions by a variety of jurisdictions also fit in here, and support to the Haitian National Police, to the multinational security mission in Haiti as led by Kenya. All of this plays together. But crucially, this needs to be brought together into a strategy. It can't just be a bunch of ad hoc elements that exist side by side. And so I think the first start to a strategy is recognizing there's a need for one. The second is to convene these stakeholders together to look at how these tools are meant to be paired, how they can be paired, and crucially, what is likely to emerge in terms of shaping the situation from all of them, and to strategically design how the interventions are developed. So, which individuals need to be focused on first? Do you go broad and attempt to counter all of the gangs? Or do you go deep and attempt to counter one gang as a very demonstrative effort? And I think, within this, if you look at the utility of open sources, quite simply, it's that you can share the information much more broadly. You can collect it potentially much more rapidly, and you can much more easily create the public case for why it is that the strategy is necessary, what it is that you're pursuing, and put out the sort of public messaging that will bring in support not just from the population within Haiti, but also from the regional population that has a vested interest in the challenge faced by Haitians, the challenge posed by organized crime in Haiti being addressed. So I think that this is crucial. Within that open source element, tracking how things have changed over time and how flows have changed over time. Tracking how the resilience of the Haitian government has changed, how the resilience and opportunities of neighboring countries has changed, I think is also a key element to take into account. This helps in better targeting the strategy and drawing it together. And so what I would say in terms of strategic design is, start with the recognition that there's a challenge, draw together stakeholders, and crucially, look at it as an adaptive strategy that is revisited on a regular basis with a lot of foresight put into it in order to make sure that as the situation within Haiti around organized crime evolves and responds, that international responses themselves are dynamic and start to shift with it in order to move the situation towards one where it's no longer destabilizing and vitally harmful to the Haitian people.
Thanks a lot. We do have more questions, so I would go straight to them and cluster them together as well. the first one is related to corruption. I think it's more, we could frame it in a way that, Laura, how is corruption incorporated within the index so that it could be used in the context of sanctions as well? And the second question, I think, is more to you, Matt. How do you think operationally foresight works with intelligence to aid policy? So let's take this to first Laura and then Matt.
Yeah, so corruption is a very serious issue, and it's not under the index. It's not considered a standalone criminal market, but it is captured in all three subcomponents of the index in different ways. So under criminal markets, corruption is considered as an aggravating factor in each criminal market score. In other words, all things considered equal, a market with a higher degree of corruption would score higher than a market that has very little. The same thing with criminal actors. Corruption is not only a major feature of the state-embedded actors type that we've previously been discussing, but the degree of cooperation with members of the state apparatus is included as a criterion in the scores for all of the other criminal actor types. And then finally, turning to resilience. So corruption really as an impediment to building resilience against organized crime and responding to it. Of the 12 resilience indicators, the government transparency and accountability indicator is explicitly corruption focused. It considers not only the actual degree of corruption within a country, but also the existence and the efficacy of transparency and oversight mechanisms that really act as a bulwark against corruption within state institutions. Corruption is also an impediment to the effective implementation of just a whole range of different resilience measures, like law enforcement or a free and fair judicial system. And so the level of corruption is also taken into account in many of the 12 resilience indicators under the index.
Yeah, I guess on intelligence and foresight, I think it's important to point out that intelligence and foresight have a long history together at the geopolitical level. So this is something that is very commonly used for geopolitical analysis within various intelligence communities. So this isn't something new on that end. I think broadly it's very useful. It allows for the sort of focus of efforts, the focus of collection, the focus of analysis and applied thinking that's crucial. I think it's much more uncommon when it comes to organized crime. Kind of historically speaking, while there has been a focus, kind of depending on the criminal market, depending on the particular intelligence organization involved, there has been a focus by some intelligence organizations on organized crime, in some cases dating back decades. I think in general, when it comes to more broadly shared informational products, and especially informational products that are developed that can be explicitly shared outside of high security confines, it's very uncommon to see foresight exercises that focus on organized crime. It's just, I don't think that it ever really made the leap from geopolitics into criminal activity. But I think that it's important that change, not just within law enforcement intelligence units or within ministries of justice, departments of justice, other entities that are focused on countering organized crime. But I think also more broadly into the think tank, more broadly into the academic community, because increasingly you're seeing a fusing, as you see in Haiti and as you see in a number of other contexts, such as Libya or increasingly Sudan, other areas, where geopolitics and organized crime are fusing together. And the key challenge, and I think that this is very well outlined within the index, is that the sort of destabilizing trends, the sort of challenges that we're likely to see increasingly crop up in the current century are linked to organized crime. Not fully, in some cases, but to a degree of embeddedness that we didn't previously see last century. And so starting to bring together these tools and bridge these different disciplines is vital going forward, because I think there's, I would very strongly bet money on the likelihood that the sort of highly damaging, highly destabilizing organized crime scenario that we've seen play out in Haiti is not going to be an aberration going forward into the rest of this century, but rather is going to be an increasingly common feature that the international community is going to have to respond to.
Thanks a lot, Matt. There were some very interesting points in there. We do have a couple of minutes more to take more questions, so please feel free to drop them in a Q&A. We do have a question that I think builds on what you were just mentioning. How target sanctions can be used when there is indication of involvement of high level officials in the illicit economies, and if that would have any implications on geopolitics in the region. And I think the question relates to Latin America specifically.
Yeah, so I mean, here it's important to really frame sanctions for what they are. They're not a criminal justice tool, they're a foreign policy tool. And so inherently, foreign policy plays into the decision to utilize sanctions on the part of sanctioning jurisdictions. And in some circumstances, the imposition of sanctions on high-level political officials is something that broadly fits within the bilateral framework or foreign policy framework of a sanctioning jurisdiction. In other cases, it might be problematic for a variety of other reasons. There are equities at play that the sanctioning jurisdiction doesn't want to risk, or the individual in question might already be under sanctions for other reasons, and so this would be seen as superfluous. But I think one opportunity there is something that we've recommended within other podcasts or other webinars, and also within our reports, which is to think about sanctioning in depth. And what we mean by this is, rather than focusing on one high-level individual, president, a key political actor, a key politician, a general, you start to focus on the lower tier individuals that are associated with them. Not because those are the reachable individuals, but because those are the indispensable individuals. So if you start to cut off access to between this high-level political official and the illicit economy by sanctioning in depth, going after the money launderers, going after those individuals that are that essentially are helping with the logistical enterprise of engagement with organized crime, and you do it systematically, moving over time to address as many of those kind of mid-level individuals that are deterrable as possible, you can slowly start to shape preferences even against powerful individuals in a given context. It might not be a full cessation of activity on their part, but it will increase the friction costs they face, and combined with other tools within a sanctioning jurisdiction's power, it's diplomatic tools. You could start to put pressure on that high-level individual to step away from involvement with organized crime, or to look at it as deleterious to their broader set of interests and impractical given the friction situations they face.
Thanks a lot, Matt. I think we are approaching the end of this session today. I know there's a lot of interest coming up, so please keep in touch. You can write to the Global Initiative so we can address questions to the panelists today, to the panelists from the other webinars as well. I recommend that those that missed some of those sessions would go back to the website, access the recordings. There are plenty of information there. You can also sign up to the Global Initiative's mail list. And I think we come to the end of this sanctions and organized crime series. Both sanctions and the index will continue its activities for the next upcoming years. So please keep in touch and keep following the work that the Global Initiative is doing in those initiatives. Thanks very much for the audience for your questions. And thanks, Laura and Matt, for your interventions today.